Good afternoon. I'm Ruth Steiner. I'm at the University of Florida, and I'm here today with Tabitha Combs to talk about new approaches to conducting traffic impact assessment. Across the country, communities of all sizes, generally cities, are modifying their approaches to traffic impact assessment. What we're presenting here today is results of ongoing project between the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and University of Florida on how traffic impact assessments have been conducted in Southeastern United States. I want to acknowledge as we begin our collaborators on this. They include Poppy Young and Andre Susi at the University of Florida, Noreen McDonald and William Lemonstall at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The University of Florida and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill are part of a consortium of 10 colleges and universities called the Southeast Transportation Research, Innovation, Development, and Education, or STRIDE Center. STRIDE Center is the 2016 USDOT Region 4 Southeast University Transportation Center with the University of Florida as the lead institution. The mission of STRIDE is to develop novel strategies for reducing congestion. The order of activities today will be first to place traffic impact assessment in the national and regional context. And in particular, I'll speak about the ITE, multimodal transportation impact assessment for site development and state and regional efforts. Then Tabitha Combs will talk about case studies in urban areas in North Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. I will then discuss the special case of Florida, and we will close out with recommendations and conclusions. There is an opportunity for you to, if you have questions as you go along, we would appreciate if you held them till the end of the presentation. You can put them in the chat. We strongly encourage you to, because we would like to have some discussion at the end of this presentation. So as we begin, for over 20 years, communities, primarily urban ones, have been struggling with conventional traffic impact assessment, which is based on the ITE Trip Generation Handbook. It is thought to encourage single-use development in suburban and peripheral areas where existing surplus traffic capacity minimizes the needs for mitigation, and it doesn't address infill projects very well. Furthermore, many have argued that the ITE trip generation estimates are based upon automobile-oriented suburban development and don't reflect contemporary urban development in areas with substantial demand for non-automobile travel modes. Finally, research suggests that conventional traffic impact assessment overestimates the impacts for developments in dense, mixed-use urban communities, leading to higher costs for infill and redevelopment and an oversupply of roadway capacity that detracts from the urban fabric and undermines efforts to improve community livability. In 2017, the ITE issued a draft update to the recommended practice, which proposes a multimodal transportation impact assessment for site development. Note that the focus has shifted from traffic impact, that is something focusing on roadways only, to transportation impact assessment focusing on all modes. The motivation for the update to recommended practice comes from several directions. First, the shift in many urban communities from predominantly greenfield, both suburban and exurban development, to infill and redevelopment, both due to both market forces and growth management policies, and largely related to fiscal cost growth outward from the center, and transportation and other community investments. Secondly is increasing understanding of differences in travel behavior across a variety of land uses and contexts from urban to rural. Third is the interest in measures of effectiveness beyond traditional automobile level of service developed at the federal, state, and local policies. And fourth, the recognition that traditional level of service or LOS measures based on roadway capacity thresholds often result in a free rider problem, or the last in concerns. That is that some people pay more than others, that it's inequitable. And it's inequitably, and it's not necessarily predictable to calculate the transportation system impacts and other exactions in an environment where free riders and last in, first in, last in issues are prevalent. The move to multimodal transportation impact assessment is intended to provide more context-sensitive solutions that allow a community to more closely match the community vision and the transportation land use that serves it. So in this study, we began, the initial research was structured to understand the role of state and regional government, especially MPOs, in affecting how land use and transportation are coordinated, and ultimately how traffic impact assessment is implemented at the local level. We quickly learned through the literature review that the connection between state and local traffic impact assessment and between regional and local assessment is much less direct than we had expected. Furthermore, each state is organized differently, so that connections between state regulation and local action was much less direct than we had expected. We examined the state regulatory framework as it has evolved and considered a variety of methods through which traffic impact assessment might be facilitated, constrained, or otherwise affected in a given state. We quickly concluded that in most states, with a few exceptions, the local government is responsible for land use regulation and for the review of transportation impacts and the determination of impact fees and other development exactions. We examined state regulations, including mini NEPAs. The National Environmental Policy Act looks at environmental impacts, but there's a few states, and we concluded quickly that there are a few states that include traffic impact assessments as a part of environmental impact assessment. According to the Council on Environmental Quality, which advises the President on the implementation of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, only 16 states plus Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. have mini NEPA regulation. 2 of these states, North Carolina and Georgia, are in the Southeast, and 2 other nearby states, Maryland and Virginia, also have mini NEPAs. Only 5 states, California, Georgia, Minnesota, New York, and Washington State, require a review of local actions and projects. A closer look at these 5 states to figure out whether they were using environmental impact assessment concluded that really only 3 states, for SEPA, SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act in Washington State, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and the SEQR, the State Environmental Quality Review in New York, include a review of transportation impacts in the environmental impact assessment. Both California and New York have begun to incorporate land use impacts, the assessment of land use impacts, into their regulatory response to climate change. So what we end up with is really a small number of states, none of which are in the Southeast, that are looking at traffic impact assessment in a serious way in their environmental impact review. We also examined statewide growth management regulations. We discovered that recent scholarship on statewide growth management is relatively fragmented. But in general, the states of Oregon, Florida, New Jersey, Maine, Rhode Island, Vermont, Georgia, Maryland, and Washington State have been identified as having statewide growth management. And while Oregon is widely recognized for the coordination of land use and transportation, it has not specifically resulted in statewide changes in traffic impact assessment, or at least as we could figure out. Florida and Washington State have long required transportation concurrency, which is a requirement that infrastructure be available concurrent with the impact of development. In this study, we looked at Florida, but we considered it separately from the states, from other states Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, largely because we quickly realized that the concurrency requirement has meant that traffic impact assessment and its connection to concurrency results in a different local traffic transportation impact assessment. Finally, we examined State Department of Transportation guidance in this area. This is where we saw the greatest variability. Trying to figure out pattern across states was extremely difficult. Each state had different state agencies addressing land development and transportation. And even within the DOTs, we had different offices that might be involved in land use transportation issues. Noteworthy among this is that the state of Florida, for instance, has the site development handbook. It was not always easy to find that for many states. So that's sort of the state. At the state level, what we generally find is we've got this a bit of connection between environmental impact assessment and transportation impact assessment or traffic impact assessment. Growth management, the concurrency seems to be the one that affects the connection between traffic impact assessment and state growth management, although interestingly enough, Washington State also has SEPA, which means that they have environmental impact assessment and growth management coming together and potentially interacting with a local traffic impact assessment. Finally, we examined this, the best source on the connection between regional transportation planning and local planning is the work in California by John Claudius Scara and Susan Handy, where they looked at MPO-driven smart growth programs and concluded that while MPOs oversee multiple transportation projects totaling billions of dollars, and increasingly they are promoting less car-dependent and more walkable and bikeable communities, the MPOs generally cannot control land use decisions needed to create local, those communities. Thus, we concluded that the connection between state and local regulation is complex and context dependent. We then decided really that the easiest way was to really think about and focus on the local implementation to begin to understand the implementation of traffic impact assessment in the Southeast. This is what we will do and did in the research. We know that conventional approaches to TIA has shortcomings, particularly for communities that are trying to move towards more multimodal, walkable, compact development patterns. Numerous entities have been working to develop alternatives to conventional TIA practice, but there's little evidence and no repository practice to show where these efforts are actually helping cities and counties change their practices. So our first objective in this research was to describe the state of TIA practice, guidance practice, starting with Southeastern and Mid-Atlantic metropolitan communities. We also wanted to know what's driving communities to change their approach to TIA and what, if anything, is holding them back. And finally, we were interested in figuring out what sorts of guidance the research community ought to be working on that would actually be of use to communities that are trying to change and adapt their TIA practice to modern travel behaviors and demands. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tabitha, who will present on her work in North Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia.
Thank you, Ruth. My name is Tab Combs. I'm a research associate at the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina. I'm going to be sharing a summary of findings from the work that Noreen McDonald and our graduate assistant, Will Lymanstall, and I did, focused on North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. So during 2018, we collected a wealth of information about TIA practices that were in use, and when those practices departed from the conventional approach to TIA, we got information about what processes communities went through in order to arrive at their current practice. We interviewed planners and engineers who were involved in the development review process in 36 cities and counties across the three-state study area. Will, our grad student, conducted all the interviews. They lasted between 30 and 45 minutes. And Will and the interviewees discussed the community's approach to TIA in detail, and then went through a list of questions touched on each of our research objectives. We transcribed the interview recordings and content analyzed them, pulling out information on current practices, as well as anything that would really help us identify themes that were related to those objectives. Our sample of communities was really pretty diverse. We had rural counties, small towns, tourist destinations, suburbs, and some major cities in the study. One key characteristic they all had in common, they were all experiencing population growth growing faster in nearly every case than the median for their state. The other thing they had in common, which I think is pretty noteworthy, is they had staff who were willing to sit down and talk with us. If any of those individuals are on the webinar today, if you're out there listening, thank you still again for your help. So what did we find? We found that TIA practices vary widely, from straight up conventional TIA to conventional TIA with minor tweaks to pretty substantial overhauls to TIA. One thing we didn't find, except under narrowly defined conditions, was a complete abandonment or replacement of TIA. Of the communities that were doing something other than conventional TIA, we found a pretty diverse range of new ideas and practices. And interestingly, we found that the farther away from conventional TIA a community got, the wider the range of uniqueness, the wider the range and uniqueness of new practices they had adopted. So communities are modifying their approach to TIA at all stages of the development review process, including changes to when and where TIA is required, tweaks to the TIA process, adjustments in how results are interpreted, and changes to mitigation criteria required to receive project approval. The most common change we found was the requirement that non-car modes be included in the analysis, or requirement that accommodations for those modes be included in required mitigations. At least one practice falling into this category was present in 76% of our communities. Close behind, 72% of communities were making an effort to address the overprediction of vehicle trip generation rates in the conventional approach. And 2/3 of our communities had mechanisms by which some or all aspects of TIA were waived for development proposals meeting specified conditions, either location, land use, zoning, or sometimes based on staff judgment. Less commonly, but still present in multiple places, we saw communities increasing the role of planning departments in scoping and reviewing TIAs, only permitting projects whose traffic impacts could be mitigated within a predefined set of acceptable mitigation strategies, and adjusting or dropping the vehicle level of service metrics that conventional TIA uses to determine whether a project's traffic impacts are likely to warrant mitigation. We also wanted to know what's driving communities to adopt these changes. So we identified, with the help of the literature, 3 categories of prerequisites needed to enable practice change. A push, in this case, they identified challenges with the conventional approach to TIA. A pull, so what were the community's transportation and land development goals, and how could TIA help them reach those goals? And finally, a catalyst, which would be a person, a group of people, or maybe an event that sparked an effort to change. So starting with the push, when we asked what's not working about the conventional approach to TIA, we got an earful. So these are the most common sorts of criticisms to conventional TIA. The first, the information derived from TIA just isn't that useful for municipalities trying to make good planning decisions. This was especially true among more urban municipalities, but we also heard it in smaller communities as well. Number 2, the scope and focus of conventional TIA are too narrow to fully capture the impacts of development on transportation conditions. We also frequently heard a number of other complaints, including that the conventional approach is too difficult and doesn't capture the impacts of atypical land uses. It discounts impacts on other travel modes. The estimates on trip generation provided in the ITE handbook overpredict vehicle traffic, which is one we certainly expected to find. And that the conventional approach doesn't just fail to support municipal efforts to create more multimodal supportive development patterns, but actually undermines those efforts. And then the pull. So this is what communities hope to get out of a different process, or at least an adaptive process. The number 1 reason for seeking an alternative approach was to find more and better ways to accommodate non-car travel modes in the development approval process. And this was followed by a desire to promote more compact, sustainable, and multimodal supportive development patterns. Other pulls included wanting to make the information derived from the TIA more relevant, ensuring that TIA practices lead to development patterns that are more in line with changing conditions and public expectations for urban spaces, more equitably distribute the costs of development across stakeholders, and then turning TIA into a tool that actually supports the community's objectives for development rather than undermining them. That was a pretty broad category. And then remember, the last ingredient that you need in order to change practices is the catalyst. The most common catalysts we identified were people, particularly internal staff and elected officials. Usually these catalysts worked in concert. The places that seemed to have had the most success in changing their practices were being driven both by staff and by elected officials. We saw a few more human drivers of change, including the public, appointed committees, developers, and an assortment of coalitions and organizations. And then in a couple of places, we also saw change coming in response to specific events or particular phenomena, including specific development proposals, local regulatory updates, and state DOT actions or policy changes. In addition to the prerequisites for change, there are also two other things that the literature suggests shape practice: barriers to adopting new practices and sources of information about new practices. First, the barriers. By far, the most common barrier to change that we found was a lack of guidance, tools, technical assistance, or data. We also saw, and these on the right are just some of the quotes that we heard from our interviewees. We also saw a diverse range of other barriers, including developers, lack of interest from elected officials, fear of congestion, and oh, here they are, and my favorite, inertia, just a sense that you're too entrenched in what you're doing to change. And then finally, you need a source of information for learning about new practices. So here's a quick look at the variety of sources of information our interviewees said that they or their communities look to when trying to find guidance on new or innovative practices. These are listed in order of popularity, starting with the #1 source, neighboring or peer communities. And that was followed by consultants, particularly consultants that work widely across a region, and then various forms of continuing education. So professional development, conferences, webinars, and then also various forms of literature. So I'm going to go back to the prerequisites for change for a minute, because before we can start to put together all of these bits of information, understand what it means, I want to go look back at specifically the pushes and the pulls, because those help us understand what's going on in our communities. So collectively, we think about these as our motivations for change at the community level, because so many of the communities express strong interest in moving TIA practices towards something that better supported multimodal focused outcomes as a motivation. We cataloged all the motivations that they expressed with respect to whether or not they reflected, at least in part, multimodal oriented objectives. We also cataloged the changes that were adopted in each place, and likewise we judged them based on, as they were applied in the community, whether they were likely to lead to more multimodal outcomes. So that was a bit of a judgment call, but most of the time it was fairly easy to make this determination. The reason we did this was to look for typologies of communities with respect to how they were approaching and thinking about, excuse me, the TIA has allowed a giant truck in my backyard. So we tried to create typologies of communities with respect to how they were approaching and thinking about TIA innovation. By focusing on the changes that were adopted and the motivations behind those changes, we can start to get a more nuanced understanding, both of the overall state of TIA practice and the relationships between change processes and change outcomes. And so we do this by looking at the changes adopted and the community's commitment to those changes. So it's actually pretty simple what we did. We just plotted communities' number of new or alternative practices with multimodal supportive applications against their stated multimodal focused motivations for change. pretty clearly 5 groupings of community emerged. First, we've got the followers, places that are managing to adopt some changes, but with no real, first we have the leaders, places that were highly motivated to change and successful in adopting changes. And we've got the followers, places that were managing to adopt some changes, but with no real direction or clear motivation for doing so. And then up there in the orange, we've got a group that are motivated or aspiring to change, but haven't really gotten any traction yet. In green, we've got what we call the lagging group. They're making some changes, but with less impetus than the aspiring group and less success than the followers. And then finally down there in the corner in the gray, communities that seemed content largely following conventional practices. So this typology is pretty useful because it helps us with our effort to identify themes with respect to why and how communities evolve their practice, and then how we can better support change in different types of communities. Surprisingly, there aren't any overt community characteristics really that correlate where they fall on this graph, not size, density, or growth rate or anything like that. But when we do look a little more deeply into the specific prerequisites for change, the change processes communities seem to follow and the barriers they had to overcome, that's where we really start seeing patterns and start being able to identify some less hard traits that seem to be correlated with success. So on the next few slides, we're just going to walk through these characteristics within each city grouping. So first, the leaders. This is pretty common sentiment that conventional TIA doesn't move cities towards good planning objectives among this group. Change was most often driven by a desire to provide more supports for non-car modes, and staff were the primary catalyst of that change. Leaders were likely to have taken a systematic approach to revamping their TIA practices to increase the role of planning in the TIA process and to support that increased role with staffing and funding, and to enlist the help of consultants with regional or national experience working with multimodal TIA practices elsewhere. Interestingly, the biggest barrier that interviewees saw in leading communities was opposition from the public. In the following group, the most common criticism of conventional TIA was that it was too hard and not really worth the effort given the information that it produces. Kind of by definition, the followers didn't really give us many reasons for making a change away from conventional practices, but those that did generally claimed to be working in the direction of more supports for non-car modes. And there's also a lack of drivers or catalysts for change among the following group, but also a lack of identified barriers to change as well. And the process of change seemed to be a bit of throw something at the wall and see what sticks. Finally, we've got the aspiring group. This group was varied in their critiques of conventional TIA, but fairly consistent in reasons for change, which was to get development patterns that more closely align with community objectives, and also to increase transparency in the development review process. Like the leaders, staff were a primary force for change in the aspiring group. They also listed elected officials and the public as drivers of change. The biggest barrier to change in the aspiring group was a lack of guidance, tools, or technical ability to follow really anything but the conventional approach to TIA. The people we talked to in this group also felt like their communities perceived opposition from developers and their state DOTs, and a fear of that opposition was a major barrier to change. They also felt like they were fighting a general fear that any changes to TIA practices would lead to more congestion. From a research standpoint, this is a really interesting group because these are places that could be in the leading group, but for, in large part, lack of guidance and information. So things that the research community clearly needs to be able to do a better job of providing. Okay, so what does all this really mean? So, well, I think it means quite a few things. We have quite a few takeaways. First, the strong push-pull data suggests that the conventional approach to TIA, with its focus on measuring and mitigating congestion, isn't what cities really need to reach their modern-day goals for transportation and land development patterns. The mismatch between the information derived from conventional TIA and the information needed to support good planning is the primary rationale for working toward change across our sample. Two, local staff matter. Staff planners and engineers are the #1 agents of change. They're the ones seeking information about new approaches to TIA through continuing education and interactions with consultants with regional experience. And despite the challenges inherent in changing practices, cities are indeed adopting new approaches to TIA. These changes fall across a wide range of contexts. Better evidence-based guidance is critical. This is apparent in the associations between success, whether a community is in the leading group or not, and the types of changes being adopted. Less successful municipalities are sticking with the tried and true, while those making the most changes are actually diverging, moving away from each other in terms of the specific changes they're pursuing. This finding suggests that municipalities are looking not necessarily for blanket best practices, but perhaps for context-sensitive practices. The trouble with that is that identifying and following context-sensitive practices requires a lot more technical and financial capability than following more blanket best practices. Which leads into the most commonly expressed sentiment, whether it came through as a push, a pull, or something else, so that more guidance, user-friendly analysis tools, and better data would help most communities better understand and be able to adopt TIA practices that are more in alignment with their stated goals. And then finally, we find that the biggest diversity of changes, in other words, the greatest potential for context sensitivity, came in municipalities that have taken a systematic approach to change and have sought information about new TIA practices from a variety of external sources, but primarily through consultants and continuing education. So I'll hand things back to Ruth at this point.
Thank you, Tab. I'm trying to put my screen up here, but okay, there we go. So we've separated Florida for a good reason, and what I'm going to do in the next few moments is to show some of, talk a little bit about the history of transportation concurrency in Florida, and then show some of the results from our analysis. In summary, one of the things we found was that all of our communities engaged in some form of adjustment of TIA. That can be seen as being related, we think it's related to the history of concurrency in Florida. For those of you not familiar with transportation concurrency was a regulation included in the Growth Management Act of the Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Act of 1985.
Hey, Ruth, if I can interrupt, sorry, you are not screen sharing.
I'm not.
You are not.
Okay. Am I now?
Yes.
Good. So basically the 1985, what's now is euphemistically called the Growth Management Act, had a requirement for concurrency, and concurrency was the basic requirement that infrastructure, including transportation, be available concurrent with the impact of development. By its nature, that requirement, and Florida and Washington State are the only two states that require it across all communities as a part of their Growth Management Act. Some communities in other parts of the country have something they call adequate public facilities ordinance, so it falls in that category. But by its nature, at least as implemented statewide, it implies a connection between land use, transportation, and the funding for transportation investments, which is how it ends up getting intertwined with the TIA and all of the processes that go on with TIA. It also, but it was put in the Act in 1985, and planning was phased throughout the state with the coastal counties and South Florida, much more urban counties beginning to implement the comprehensive planning mandate in the Growth Management Act. So by the late 1980s, there was starting to be concern that concurrency did not work well in urban areas, largely because they weren't going to be able to widen their road. Well, first of all, the implementation of concurrency was called transportation concurrency, but it in fact was set up that the measure of concurrency was, do you meet the level of service standards for the roadway? So it was transportation concurrency in name, but really highway conventional traffic impact assessment. And for urban areas, there was not going to be the opportunity to expand beyond their existing right-of-ways. Land acquisition was going to be expensive, and there needed to be some tools in order to implement concurrency, but also really to find ways for local governments to meet their community goals within the framework of the Growth Management Act and the requirements for local comprehensive planning. In the early 1990s, the state introduced planning, over time developed a number of planning tools. I don't need to go into the details of them, but they were called transportation concurrency exception areas, transportation concurrency management areas, and there was something called a long-term concurrency management system. These were all introduced and began to be used in the 1990s. At the end of in 1998, the state began to realize that there wasn't enough of an emphasis on community design. And they introduced the notion of doing multimodal transportation planning. And they began to implement that over established methodologies, which went beyond the conventional level of service measures to something called multimodal transportation districts, something called area-wide planning. So what you really begin to recognize when you look at what happened here is Florida started with conventional level of service analysis that would lead to what it would be conventional traffic impact assessment. And really over the 1990s and the early parts of between 2000, 2005 or so, or really even continuing, they developed a strategy to begin to think about multimodal impacts, predating this, the national discussion in many ways. And all of these were implemented into the statewide guidance. In 2005, we had a set of amendments. Remember 2005, that's when everybody couldn't build fast enough. And basically concurrency was arguably working, because in some contexts, development was stopping at a time when developers wanted to get things into the ground. And the state ended up, what I would argue is finally putting teeth into concurrency, because even though concurrency was said to be about coordinating land use, transportation, and investment, it in fact was, the investment part was not that well coordinated with capital improvement planning. The 2005 Act basically said, if you don't have a cost feasible plan and the projects in your capital improvements plan, if you don't have the transportation facilities in your comprehensive, your capital improvements plan, you can't do comprehensive plan amendments. And so this really put teeth in by basically saying land use transportation needs to be coordinated with transportation investments. That was not to last for very long. There was, of course, we had the recession beginning in 2008. 2009, there were some amendments reducing the burden on requirement for concurrency. And in 2011, the Community Planning Act, which is seen by many as basically, well, first of all, it eliminated a strong state role. Up to this point, the state was seen as driving the process. It was criticized for being a one-size-fits-all, which is what conventional traffic impact assessment is criticized for. But in the long run, basically, the Community Planning Act says communities, you know what you need to do. We don't need heavy-handed state oversight. There's still a state oversight in terms of making sure that there's coordination of comments on a comprehensive plan amendment. But local governments have the opportunity to be a little more self-sufficient and not have the state oversight that they had in the planning realm. From a transportation concurrency perspective, the Community Planning Act basically made transportation concurrency optional. However, if a community does not continue transportation concurrency, they need to show how they are going to plan for all modes of transportation. So we went from a system that arguably, that general practice is not to necessarily deal with multimodal planning, to these exception areas and multimodal transportation districts, allowing communities that really want to be on the cutting edge, be engaged in enhanced TIA practice, gave them the opportunity to do that. Furthermore, if they wanted to opt out of concurrency, they would have to do multimodal planning. So in some respects, when it comes to understanding the use, what you'll see in a moment on how it is being used should not surprise you, which is, well, just a general note on methodology. We use the same set of interview protocols as Tab and Noreen used in and Will used in North Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. But we really, we did add a few questions or probed a little bit on the connection to concurrency. And basically what we discovered with the 18 communities we were able to contact was that all made some modification to TIA, but how they used it varies. And we found some differences. We could not, again, like what Tab mentioned, we had a difficult time sorting on size of community and whether they were using concurrency exception areas or not. The patterns were not, we couldn't find systematic patterns based on certain kind of factors. But we did find within this group, we had 10 that used strong multimodal and sustainability, were highly motivated by multimodal and sustainability arguments. We also found 5 that had rescinded concurrency, but recall that a rescission, ending concurrency simply means replacing it with some form of multimodal planning. So in summary, I would say we end up with some of the same, probably a greater use of enhanced TIA than you see in North Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. And you could attribute it to a greater extent to the fact that the state really has emphasized over time, has increased awareness among local planners of the need to plan for multimodal TIA. So in terms of recommendations and conclusions, we, on the research side, we recognize there really is a need for continuing research on how TIA is implemented. There is a lot of interest in it. There's probably a great need for it. We also recognize that this connection, while in our research, just because of the lack of time and money, but the connection between state regulation and local implementation would be an area for additional research, and certainly the situation that happened in Florida reinforces that point. In terms of other recommendations, we have a set related to implications for planning. First of all, we discovered that really cities and counties are working to adapt or change TIA practice with clear motivation and goals for doing so. They are adopting a wide variety of ways. The divergence in new practices among leading communities suggests that these communities are at the forefront of developing the new best practices. We need to find ways to support these efforts and adapt these best practices for aspiring and following communities, especially with the need for better planning support tools and locally calibrated models. A second set of is we recognize that there is an appetite for change and for new information on innovative TIA practices. We need to tap into the ways local governments are seeking that information. Should we do more on peer exchanges, peer networks, conferences, literature, and other similar methodologies? And third, we came to recognize that the staff are driving change, which means two things. We need to better educate tomorrow's staff, and we need to figure out how to better support and empower planners in practice. That is the end of our presentation. We're asking you to complete the survey. You should have, I believe, received a link to the survey and the link is in the chat box. So at this point, we also will invite your questions. If you've been I've not had a chance to look at the chat box lately, but we're assuming there's some questions, or that you will have some questions. And I think that's the end of our presentation. So the one question we receive, how does environmental concerns addressed in Florida? DCA went away and local government does not offer a comprehensive review. Yes, that's partially beyond the scope of this. I would say the traffic impact assessment transportation impact assessment had never really been part of the environmental review. And I think this is probably, I've always recognized this as a missing link. I got into planning more on the environmental side than on the transportation side. And this is consistent with my observation about what's happening in Florida. So that's the first question. Perhaps you have a follow-up, but Tab, do you have anything to add to that?
No, not in the Florida case. You guys are a special case down there.
Well, is there anything from North Carolina that you think applies here?
No, I really don't. The environmental aspect doesn't really take much. It doesn't have to have a role in the TIA process. And there are environmental reviews that go in with the development review process, but they tend to be driven through different processes than the transportation process.
Well, and that I would say that's somewhat what we found in our attempt to review what states were doing and try to make an explicit link, is that really how states are doing it is extremely different. And although one other point I would make is I believe that what I'm starting to notice is that both California and New York, with their climate change legislation, are making the explicit link to the environment on the traffic impact assessment. And I don't know if that's a start of a trend, but it is probably worthy of watching that in the long term.
Yeah. Looks like a couple more questions are coming in. One is, any cases of the local jurisdiction having a different TIA metric, such as VMT, when the state DOT requires conventional TIA? If so, how are they incorporated or reconciled in the development process? So that's something that we did encounter in a couple of places in the North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland region. In all three of those states, the state DOT owns or manages the majority of roads in the state. And we really only saw departures from traditional metrics in communities that had control over some of their own roads. And we did focus on larger, more metropolitan communities, and so that biased us towards places where towns did have transportation or public works departments. And there seemed to be this ability to impose your own standards on your own roads, but if a state road fell within the scope of the proposal, then you default to the state standard. That's particularly the case in North Carolina. There was one community in North Carolina that took an attitude of, well, we're going to do it our way, and they can harass us, but we'll still do it our way. But by and large, communities went with what the state requirements were, unless they had some sort of exception that they got on a one-off basis from the state, Virginia, that seemed to be most common in Virginia. Or if they completely controlled all of the roadways within the radius of the proposal.
One thing I would add on that, if you want to look at a state that's has a great deal of flexibility, it's Washington State. At least though I did research between 10 and 15 years ago on the implementation of concurrency in the state of Washington. And one of the things that they have built into their system is that local governments could choose to measure the concurrency, that is transportation land use coordination, in any way they wanted. So you had some cities that were looking at things like, instead of conventional level service, they might say, how long does it take to get from key points in the community? And that was being done at the local level, and it was incorporated into it. There were a wide range of methods through which, I'm just using that as an example, but except to say that I don't know what's happened in Washington. I haven't thought about it in quite a while. I did see one of our participants, Mark Hallenbeck, is on this call and on this presentation, so he may have some response to that. But at least as of, and the design of the Washington State growth management really is to allow a great deal of decision making at the local level on metrics. So.
Got another question. Did you do any work documenting the diverse practices being pursued by the leading communities? I assume this question is for the North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland part, but it might be for all of it. Yeah, the answer is yes, we do, and can share what we found with the kinds of practices that were being adopted at the leading edge. They were all quite unique. I mean, they fit within the categories overall, but the individual approaches were really unique. I mean, it really did seem like there was a strong push toward context sensitivity. And we've got a couple of papers, open access papers, that are out that get into a lot more detail about the specific practices and where and how they're being implemented.
So I do want to point out, Mark Hallenbeck has said, from what you said is still true in Washington, and like your webinar, we range from leaders to conventional, so we're trying new things. Others are using variations on roadway level of service. Tab, did you want to go to the slide that shows some of the adjustments?
Let's see. Yeah, you can scroll down to that one. Yeah, I think it's the very next, almost the next slide.
Is this the one you had in mind?
Yeah, yeah. So this doesn't break it out by, no, go back up.
One more?
No. Yeah, right. Nope. One more. No, down one. Yeah. Down. So okay. This is, it wants to go. It doesn't want to stay there. I don't know why. So if you can look really quickly, maybe screenshot it before it goes again. This is, now it stays. Yes. These are examples of the kind of practice changes that fell within each category. And then, Ruth, if you do want to go on to the next one, we've got a couple of slides that you may have to click a couple of times. Yep. That show samples of the specific applications. And these may have been from following and aspiring communities, or even some of the leading ones that represent things that seemed fairly simple to do, readily accessible changes. And then you want to click through a couple more times, Ruth, and we'll get to the changes that were technically simple, but politically or financially demanding. And then one more slide, please.
Okay, okay.
All right. And then the ones that seemed challenging, but were potentially very impactful. And these, we only saw in the leading communities. So really a big range of, it made it incredibly difficult to categorize what communities were doing once they started moving away from the conventional approach. So I guess that's the long and short of it.
Okay. I don't see any new questions, and we're down to less than 5 minutes. So I want to remind you again, I'm going to put on our slide so you know who we are and where to find us. One other reminder, there's an upcoming webinar on strategies for mitigating congestion in small urban and rural areas on November 4th at 12 p.m. By Dimitra Mikulaka and Michael Hunter. You can have an opportunity to register, and here's our contact information if you're looking for that.
Also, please, before you leave, look in the chat box for the link to a brief Qualtrics survey about the webinar today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.